Okay, folks, this is Eli Sagor in St. Paul. Got a big crowd here in our new St. Paul broadcast site, and really glad to welcome everyone else wherever you are, whether at your own computer or one of the other sites around the state. We're glad you're with us. Our speaker today is Charlie Blinn. Charlie is on the faculty here with Extension in the Department of Forest Resources on the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. He's going to be sharing some research that he's conducted over the last few years in partnership with MFI and the Minnesota Logger Education Program, whose logo should appear here on this opening slide. Many of you are familiar with Charlie. I'm not going to give him too much more introduction. I'll hand the floor over to him to start us off.
Thanks, Eli. And so I think many of us understand really the importance of loggers in the wood supply chain in terms of what they do for forest management and implementing silvicultural activities, as well as their key role in providing wood to forest products companies. They're also big, very important individuals in communities all around the state too, because of the products they purchase for their business, the roles that they play in those local governments, and so on. And so over the years, we've conducted a number of surveys of logging businesses, and what I really want to do today is tell you information about the most recent survey, which was conducted about 2 years ago, looking at logging businesses in 2011. As Eli said, the study was a cooperative between the Minnesota Forest Industries, the Minnesota Logger Education Program, whose logo, for some mysterious reason, has disappeared from the screen today, and the University of Minnesota. So what I want to do is provide a little bit of background, talk briefly about some of the previous work that's been done, talk about some of the demographics. So what does the average logger look like? Then move into some deeper views of that data from our loggers, and talk about some of the focus groups that we conducted too, to try to understand what some of the information was that we learned from those surveys, and then wrap that up with some conclusions. So in terms of background and approach, this is actually the 5th survey that's been conducted. The first one was done in the late 70s. The second one was done as a part of the GEIS in 1991. We did a 3rd survey in 96. A 4th one was done in 2003, and this one was done in 2011. So we mailed out surveys about 2 years ago in April of 2012 to all the members of the Minnesota Logger Education Program. There were 427 members at the time, and so all individuals who were members, all logging business owners, received a copy of the survey. The survey raised several questions among us at MFI, MLEP, and the university, so we decided to conduct some focus groups in 2013 with industry and logging business owners to learn more about, to probe deeper into some of the questions that we had that came up through the survey, and also to ask some new questions that we hadn't thought of perhaps at that time. So the survey that was mailed out in 2012 asked about the status of their business in 2011. So it asked questions really in 4 different areas. The first one was general business background. Where is your business located? How many years has your business been in operation? And how many employees do you have? Then we asked some things about their harvest operation in terms of number of tracts that they cut in 2011. How many tracts were cut in different tract size categories? Then we asked them about their stumpage sources. What % of your wood comes from state land, from county land, from industry land, from federal land, from private land, and then from other sources too? And then what % of your wood is supplied by somebody else? It could be a broker, it could be from industry, versus wood that you've actually procured yourself. We asked them about their production in 2011, and then we asked them about operations during the 4 seasons. What % of your wood was cut in each of the 4 seasons? Then we asked them about their in-woods and over-the-road equipment. How old is it? What kind of equipment do you have? Where do you process things in the woods? What sort of harvesting systems are you using? And then we asked them about future plans, concerns, and then some of the upcoming training needs that they may identify for themselves and for others in their business. So looking at the overall survey, we mailed out again 427 surveys. We had a response rate of usable responses of 57%. So that's by far and away the highest response rate we've ever had from one of these surveys. So really want to do a shout out to all the loggers who might be listening today, thanking them for all their participation in this. That response rate is probably about double the highest rate we've ever had before. And so there were 226 usable responses. We deleted any respondent that produced fewer than 100 chords in 2011. There were some who said, I just cut a little bit, and it ended up being less than 100. We chose that 100 mark in order for us to be able to be compatible with a similar survey that was done in Wisconsin that defined a similar floor for their survey as being 100 chords. And then for primarily every result that I'll talk about from here on, it's really based on the average respondent. So whether that respondent produced 100 chords in 2011 or 100,000 chords in 2011, they're still a respondent. So the first thing we wanted to do was take a look at where did our responses come from. And to do that, we looked at it in terms of the DNR's regions in the state. So we had the Northeast, the Northwest, and then we combined the Central and Southern regions together because we had far fewer responses from both of those areas. So the blue bars represent the number of respondents from each of those three regions that we created. So you can see 58% of our responses came from the Northeast region in the state. And that compares pretty well with the membership list of MLEP that we used as our source file. So 8.3% of the people that received the survey were from that Central Southern region, 57% were from the Northeast, and 34% from the Northwest. So we thought we had done a pretty good job of getting a representative sample of respondents from the three different regions. So now getting to what's the average logging business. So the average business has been in business for 28 years. You look at that graph at the bottom, and almost half the businesses have been in business for more than 30 years, or for 30 years or more. So we have really an old base of logging businesses in the state, which in many ways is good. But as I'll talk about later, it also raises some concerns. And then you'll see that there's a trickling down effect with fewer percent of responses in each of the subsequent categories. So how does this compare to some of the previous surveys? Well, in 1996, the average business had been around for 17 years. In 2003, it was 25. So clearly, we're aging our businesses. And just focusing on the percent of firms that are at least 31 years of age, in 2011, it was 41%. In 2003, it was almost 28%. So almost a 50% jump in the percent of businesses that are at least 31 years of age, just over that 8-year period. So certainly an aging logging force. The average business had 6.3 employees, including the logging business owner. The median was 5, but the range was from 1 to over 70. The average business is a conventional logging operation with using a feller buncher, grapple skidder, a stroke delimber, and then a slasher at the landing. And then the average business uses 4.6 cords of fuel, diesel fuel, to produce and deliver a cord of wood. So that's both the fuel that they use in the woods as well as over the road to bring that cord to a mill. I was out with some students in my class about 3 weeks ago, and we visited a logging business owner, and he said at that time he was paying $4.70 for number 1 diesel. And so the math says that he's paying about $21.50 a cord just in fuel to cut, skid, process, and deliver a cord of wood. So fuel is becoming a much bigger percent of their total overall cost. We asked them, what are the biggest issues that you face today? And to do that, we used a list that was similar to one that they'd been presented with in previous years and added a few new things to it. So the top three were rising operating costs, market prices, and stumpage prices in that order. So if you look at it, it's really saying my cost to buy wood, my cost to process wood, and the cost that I get at the mill, which really is everything for them. And so the top five all related to markets, stumpage, and operating costs. And the bottom three all related to employee concerns, my ability to hire people or to release people or to provide benefits were the kind of things that were at the low end of their concerns. Although they are concerns, they were much lower than these top three kinds of things. So again, looking back in 2003, the top three were stumpage prices, rising operating costs, and stumpage availability. There was some difference in the wording a little bit between the surveys, which shows why we have some differences in terms of the top three there. But again, it really gets at the stumpage that I have available and then my cost to produce that stumpage, to bring it to the landing, get it ready for over-the-road hauling. In 1979, the top issues were rising costs without any definition of what that meant, and then the price that they receive for wood. So you can kind of sum up from all this that the issues that loggers are facing haven't really changed over the last 35 years. It really relates to their ability and cost to buying wood, to processing that wood, and the price they get at the mill. But one thing I noticed in the 2011 responses as I looked at the open-ended comments at the back of the survey was there seemed to be a lot more written comments than I'd ever seen before. And the comments really related to, number one, it's really becoming more difficult for me to maintain my profitability. So that was much more common than I'd ever seen in the past. And also there was a broader array of comments too. So they commented on things like my ability to find qualified labor, not just labor, but qualified labor was the term they used. Even though it was at the bottom three of the overall concerns, they still were concerned about that. The regulations, whether they might be from certification, from guidelines, or something else. Concerns about agencies, and that they didn't hold back on almost any agency. And then also concerns about individual foresters. How come foresters can't be consistent, or how come all foresters can't be consistent so that when I get visited by this forester or that forester, I'm always getting the same thing. They're always concerned about the same issue, whereas one forester might be concerned about this and another forester might be more concerned about something else. So as we totaled up the volume that our respondents provided, and not everyone completed this question, it was almost 2 million cords. And back in 2011, that represented about 75% of the total volume that was harvested that year. Again, not everyone that sent in a survey provided an answer to that question, though. The average volume across all of our respondents to this question was 9,500 cords, but the median was 4,000, suggesting that there are a lot of respondents producing a small volume of wood. And as indicated there, the range is from 100, which we set as the artificial low, all the way up to almost 139,000 cords. So we had a few producers generating over 100,000 cords, and then many producers that were in 1,000 or fewer. The average cutting block size was 31.6 acres, which corresponds pretty well with the silvicultural survey that Tony D'Amato has conducted over the years too. And we asked them what percent of the volume was cut by a feller buncher or cut to length system or by a chainsaw. 4 out of 5, 82% of the total volume was cut by a feller buncher, 16 by a cut to length, and then 2% by chainsaws. So those volumes are pretty consistent versus a previous survey. but as you would imagine, there's a lot more CTL in this survey and in 2003 as compared to the surveys in the 90s, and it never existed back in the 70s. So chainsaw volume is really getting smaller and smaller and smaller over time. We also asked them about their, as we looked at their harvest volume, we wanted to plot that based on the DNR's 3 regions that I talked about before. So 64%, about 2/3 of the volume that was cut and reported to us came from the Northeast region. The average respondent in the Northeast produced about 10,500 cords. In the Northwest, about 30% of the volume was produced, and the average producer there generated about 8,800 cords. In the Central and Southern region, it was about 6%, and the average respondent was about 5,900 cords there. Again, we asked them about where did you get your wood from? Who was the landowner that provided that stumpage that you harvested in 2011? About 64% of the total volume came from public agencies, the state being 34%, counties 27%, and then the Forest Service was 3%. After that, privates were 21%, and industry was 14%. So the other group, primarily Native American sources, were 1%. So public agencies still supply about 64% of the wood in 2011. We also asked them about what percent of your volume was harvested in the 4 different seasons. And you'll notice on the left-hand side how we define seasons as DJF is December, January, February. And you might say, well, I know winter wood comes out in March. But the problem is, if we want to compare survey results in this survey to previous surveys, we need to maintain the same structure in terms of how we define winter, spring, summer, and fall. So winter was December, January, February here, as it had been in previous surveys. So you can see in this graph that 51% of the total volume was harvested in winter, followed by fall being 21% and summer being 20%. Spring, as you would imagine, was the smallest percentage. Looking at trends over time, we're really seeing more winter wood coming out as compared to the 96 and 91 surveys, and less summer wood. So we've gone from 43% winter wood in 1991 to 51% today. And summer percentage was 23% in 91 and 20% today. Also, we're seeing that these larger volume producers tend to be the ones that are harvesting on a year-round basis, whereas the smaller producers harvest only during the winter. So year-round access to stumpage is really important to a larger producer. Then for everyone who supplied information about the volume that was harvested in 2011, we broke that down into 6 different volume categories: 100 to 1,000 cords produced, 1,001 to 5,000 cords, and then continuing over to the right to the largest category, which was over 20,000 cords produced in 2011. So the blue bars represent the number of respondents in each one of those categories, and then the red line is the percent of the total volume that is made up by that bar. So first, looking at the blue bars, on the left-hand side, those respondents who produced up to 5,000 cords, those 122 individuals, they represent 58% of the total respondents. But yet they produced 12% of the total volume in 2011. The 38% of the respondents who produced more than 15,000 cords represented 12% of the total respondents, but yet they produced 65% of the total volume. So of those 30 largest producers, 21 of those are located in the DNR's Northeast region. And looking back over time, the percent of businesses who produce more than 15,000 cords we're seeing is really increasing. So in 1996, it was about 4%. In 2003, it was almost 9%. And today, in 2011, it was about 18%. So we're seeing this gradual shift of percent of businesses that are harvesting more than 15,000 cords. But yet we still see a large number of businesses operating at that level under 5,000 cords. We asked producers not only to tell us what did you produce in 2011, but if you had to guess, what do you think you could have produced in 2011? And so the excess capacity then represented 59% beyond what they actually harvested. So if we had additional capacity in terms of markets, there certainly is, or was at that time, a lot of additional capacity to meet demand to provide wood then to those mills. As we look at a business in terms of where it can operate most efficiently, really the higher it can get towards 70%, maybe 75% of its total operating capacity, probably the better it is at being able to pay off some of its fixed costs. So fixed costs might be, as an example, paying off its loan. So the more it can keep that business operating productively, the more time it can spend paying off those fixed costs. So as we look at different operating methods for a chainsaw system versus feller buncher versus cut to length versus a business we call multiple that fells trees perhaps with a feller buncher and cut to length, or a feller buncher and sometimes perhaps chainsaw. Those businesses such as cut to length and multiple tended to have much better percent of total operating capacity than did the chainsaw systems, which were operating at about 56% of their total operating capacity. So Eli, it's about 25 after. I built in a little break now. Anybody have a question?
Folks, you can go ahead and type any questions into the chat pod, and I will forward those on to Charlie. He's not looking at the chat pod right now, but I am. So we'll pause for just a minute, see if any questions come in. If not, we'll continue.
Any questions from the audience here? Okay, seeing none.
While we're waiting for any questions to come in, I'll remind folks, those of you who are interested in continuing education credits, either through SAF or the Forest Stewardship Program here in Minnesota, I will be sharing a link near the end of the presentation. You'll need to fill out a very short form online to get that credit. Anyone who's at a broadcast site, including here in St. Paul, if you're interested in those credits, we have sign-up sheets that should be at the back of the room or in some convenient place. Be sure to sign those before you leave. We do need to have those before the end of the presentation. I don't see any questions. Oh, here we go. We got a couple coming in. From Ross Meyer, do you do any even informal analysis of those respondents under 100 cords?
We did not, Ross. I believe the number was maybe 6. And so some of the reasons were that the person might have got sick during the year, or I just cut a little bit of firewood. So even though they were still a member of the Minnesota Logging Business Program, they hadn't cut enough wood for us really to be concerned with them. Then there were others who just said, I was sick during the entire year, so we didn't obviously include them either. But we never went back and further contacted those producing less than 100 cords.
Next question from Matt Tyler. Will you touch on the types of skidders used?
In terms of makes and models, Matt, or in terms of cable or grapple? And so I do have some of the subsequent analysis that looks at comparing cable skidders to grapple skidders in terms of their production level, in terms of how they see themselves as being healthy. I did not look at comparing a timberjack skidder to a John Deere skidder to a Caterpillar skidder to any other kind of skidder.
So Charlie, Matt elaborated that he did mean cable versus grapple or forwarder.
Yeah, and so Matt, I think this next section will get at some of the questions that you're asking about, and if not, there's another question period that we built into this as well as at the end. So if not, again, please ask that question.
I've got a couple more here, Charlie, from Susan. Many people heat with firewood. Does this presentation look at that business?
If they are a member of the Minnesota Logger Education Program and they cut more than 100 cords of wood in 2011, yes. If they are not a member of that program, it does not include them.
Next question is from Kurt Hins down in southeast Minnesota. Any correlation between the cutting system used and the percent of value produced? Chainsaws, it says parenthetically, chainsaws used on southeast hardwoods. I think that means chainsaws may be more common in those systems. Any thoughts on that?
Could you repeat that again, Eli?
Yeah. I'll read it exactly as it was typed in. Any correlation between the cutting system used and the percent of value produced? Chainsaws used on southeast hardwoods.
Yeah, and so we made no attempt to look at the value per cord of material. And so while we did have a question that looked at, of the production in 2011, what volume was in pulpwood versus saw timber versus veneer versus chips, we never related that back at all to a price that that stumpage might be. So I think the answer is no.
All right, and that's all of the questions that I see right now, so why don't you continue?
Great, thanks, Eli. And so we asked folks to think about how was your profitability in 2011 as compared to 2008. And so why 2008? Well, we figured it'd be hard for them to think back more than about 3 years. Also, we thought that in 2008, some of the shakedowns that had happened in the market might have settled down a little bit. We lost some capacity in mills prior to 2008, and things were beginning to settle a little bit back then. And so it just made sense for us to compare 2011 to 2008. And so as we looked at that, 60% of our respondents said that things were worse, either much worse or worse in 11 as compared to 2008. But about 20% said that things were better, either slightly or much better. And so we'll get into looking at, so who said things are better in some of our subsequent slides. And we'll look at who said things are worse. So in our focus groups, one thing that we wanted to ask folks, both in this case loggers only, was why would a higher percentage of respondents who produced more than 5,000 cords indicate that their profitability was better in 11 than in 08 as compared to respondents who produced fewer than 5,000 cords? So we noticed that these bigger producers, in this case bigger meant more than 5,000 cords, thought that their year was better in 11 than it was in 8. There were a higher percentage of them. So they said, as compared to smaller producers, these larger producers get more for their stumpage at the mill. They're more efficient, perhaps because they're cutting, they have more wood and they're able to retain labor better throughout the year. They're able to log some stumpage that might be controlled by a mill. So perhaps a higher percentage of the stumpage that they were cutting for those larger producers, again, larger than 5,000 cords, in this case, were being provided by a third party, maybe by a mill. Whereas the smaller producers would not tend to get that stumpage from a mill. So every business that responded to the survey provided information about things related to their production or years in business or average tract size or percent of stumpage from family forests, state or county, and a variety of other things. So what we wanted to do is to see that there might be differences in terms of how these respondents look at things based on things like production level. So as we have big producers and small producers, not only is their production level different, but have they been in business for a different number of years? Or are the tract sizes that they cut different? Or do they buy their wood from different sources, perhaps? Or do they have a smaller percent of their stumpage coming from summer as compared to other producers? We wanted to look at in-woods transport methods, kind of getting at Matt's question. So are businesses which skid only with cable skidders different from businesses that skid with grapple skidders? different from businesses that skid with CTL or those that have a mixed business. And then finally, percent of stumpage that's provided by somebody else. So for a business that buys all of its stumpage, is that different from a business that gets a lot of its stumpage provided by somebody else? And then all gradations kind of in between that. So I'll run through these three different variable assessments that we did. So we broke production down into these 5 different groupings. Those who produced up to 1,000, just over 1,000 to 5,000, and then the biggest in this case was more than 15,000. And again, we looked at them in terms of all those variables that I talked about in the previous slide. So here, the smallest producers, those who produced up to 1,000 cords, tended to have the lowest or smallest average years in business. They harvested the smallest track size. They tended to think that 2011 was frequently not as good as 2008 for the most part. They had the lowest percentage of them thought they would increase or maintain production in 5 years. So they're not really looking at growing the business in 5 years. They had the lowest level of summer production. In fact, it's significantly level than other levels, than other groupings that we looked at, other production levels. And they tend to operate at the lowest percent of reported capacity. But they do have the highest percentage of their volume coming from family forests. So they are an important source for logging on family forests. So comparing our smallest producers to those biggest producers out there, they tended to have the highest or largest average years in business. So perhaps they started out as a small business and maybe over time grew that into a bigger business. They have the largest track sizes, largest fuel consumption. They expect the largest expectation to be in business in 5 years, and they also have high expectations to maintain or increase production in the next 5 years. So in our focus groups, we asked the loggers, when do you have the greatest potential to increase your production? And knowing a lot of these loggers, it wasn't difficult to know really at what production level do they produce at, then try to categorize them. So our largest producers said, really, if I'm going to increase my production, it's going to be in the summer. I am working long hours, long days, long months, it seems, during the winter, but I can produce more during the summer, but I need access to wood and markets to be able to do that. And those smaller producers who generally tend to only harvest during the winter said, it's winter. If I can cut more wood in the winter, I know I can increase my production. So they really said that in order to be able to address these issues and largely focused on those bigger producers, they need access to more stumpage. So the larger producers especially said, I need more summer chance wood to be able to do that. And then everyone said, I really need access to better and more markets. Looking at our transport methods, kind of getting at Matt's question, there were businesses who skidded 100% of their wood with a cable skidder. Others skidded 100% with a grapple skidder and produced up to 5,000 cords, or produced 5,001 to 15,000, or more than 15. There were others that produced 100% of their volume using cut to length. And then others used a mixed approach. So it might be cut to length with a grapple skidder with cable skidder, grapple skidder with, or cable skidder with cut to length, mixing any of those two of those three options together. And here we just looked at those businesses harvesting more than 5,000 cords or more in terms of being mixed. So the cable skidder businesses, as you might imagine, they had the best fuel economy. They obtained over half their stumpage or about half their stumpage from family forests, and they had that lowest level of summer production. So that they really tend to be those smaller producers that we talked about in that previous comparison. The grapple skidder businesses, just looking at the very largest of the three categories that we studied, tend to harvest the largest tracts of all the groups that we looked at. And they also have that highest in woods fuel consumption per cord. CTL businesses were the youngest of all the categories. They harvest the smallest tracts, harvest a higher percentage of their they had the highest percentage of things being better in 11 than in 08. So these operators tended to see 11 as having a higher chance of being good in 11 than in 2008. The highest expectation to be in business in 5 years, and so on. And they also tended to operate at that highest percentage of their reported capacity. Those mixed businesses had been in business the longest and had the highest level of summer production. So the mixed business might have grown from a small business before, saw the opportunities then to expand the business in terms of the site opportunities, some wetter sites, some drier sites, some sites that might need certain silvicultural treatments, and expanded their operations out to be able to accommodate what they saw was that demand. But across all groups, it didn't matter what sort of equipment mix we looked at. State and county stumpage were very important for those businesses. And then the third grouping or category that we looked at was percentage stumpage that was provided by somebody else. And that someone else could be a forest products company, or it could be a broker. So a question came up, are those businesses that are getting more wood provided by somebody else really better off in some way than somebody else? So we looked at this analysis in terms of two different groupings. And the first one was those who are getting a higher percentage of their stumpage provided by somebody else versus a lower percentage of that stumpage provided by somebody else. And the levels that we set were more than 75% or more versus less than 75, and then greater than 50 versus up to 50. So as we look at those comparisons, again, the higher percentage, comparing that to that lower percentage, higher being over 75 or over 50, those in the higher percentage had been in operation longer, so the business had been around longer. They tended to be the larger producers. They harvested larger tracts. They had a higher percentage of things being better in 11 than in 08. So there might be some relationship between having somebody help provide some of your stumpage and your thought about things being better. They had a higher percentage of their wood being produced during the summer, and then a significantly higher percentage of them had a higher operated at a higher percentage of their total capability than the lower percentage folks did. So looking at the lower percentage folks, though, a higher percentage of their procurement came from family forests, state and county. And then they also had higher expectations to be in business in 5 years, which seemed kind of funny to us. Why would a lower percentage be significantly higher in terms of their higher expectation to be in business in 5 years? And a thought from some of our focus group respondents was, for some of these loggers that have been very used to providing wood, a very high percentage of their wood to one market, once that market disappears, then all of a sudden that business is out scurrying looking for markets, and it raises a lot of concern. And so there are businesses that have been really concerned about, by having all my eggs in one basket, is that going to be good for my business in 5 years? So some other observations were 25% of our businesses don't expect to be in business in 5 years. But those 25% represent only about 250,000 cords. And the average respondent of those 25% produced 5,700 cords versus 9,500 overall. So obviously they're the smaller producers in this case. 25% figure is comparable to Wisconsin surveys in 2003 and 2011. Also, that 25% figure is what you might expect to see from farmers too. Some of them don't expect to be in business in 5 years. So maybe it's something that is just symptomatic of logging businesses, agricultural businesses. Some of them don't expect to be around 5 years from now. But curiously, over half of them said that they don't see a future generation in their business taking over the business. So a niece, a nephew, a son, a daughter, being willing to take the business over in the future. So they don't really have a viable succession plan for their business that they foresee. So why aren't businesses passing on the ownership then to another member in the business? We asked this of industry. And so some owners just aren't encouraging that. And I've heard that from some logging business owners, that this is not the place you want to invest your time and effort in the future. There's so much uncertainty. Others said that even though you pass it on to somebody in the family, that doesn't guarantee success. And then others are looking to transfer the business to somebody who's outside of the family, but still inside of the business. So to somebody who might be their fellow buncher operator, but with a different last name, who has no relationship at all to the family. So why don't young people enter logging today? We asked this of both logging business owners and industry. And they said, first, there's a negative perception about logging. I could make almost as much in logging as if I were unemployed. So why work? Or if I work somewhere else, I could make as much in logging too. Or we heard in many cases that younger people today just have a poor work attitude and ethic. Others said it's the high cost of entry. To buy equipment is very expensive, so you just can't afford to do that. Others said you're not going to get a good contract if you start in business today. It's going to take years for you to be able to do that. So if you want to buy equipment, you don't have the base of mill contracts to go to a lender and try to help you out in securing loans. And others just said, really, there's a low profit margin in this. Why would somebody log? We asked people about the age of their equipment. So what's the age of the newest piece of CTL that you have in CTL harvesters in your business? It was 7.6 years. A Feller Bunchers, 14.8. That compared to 8 years in 91 and 11 in 96. And then for slashers, it's 14, which is double 91 and 5 years more than in 96. So clearly, we're aging our equipment base out there too. We asked them about what are you going to replace and what are you going to replace it with? And so 2/3 of our respondents said, when I replace equipment, it's going to be with pre-owned equipment. But remember, I just said that a lot of the existing equipment is aging. And so if you replace it with that aging equipment, you're going to get some potential problems associated with that. And then the highest in woods demand is going to be for grapple skidders. Going back to that first slide, one of the first slides, 82% of the total volume was felled with a Feller Buncher, which matches up really well with a grapple skidder. So looking at the average age of the newest piece of equipment projected against volume produced in 2011, on the left-hand side are our smallest producers, right-hand side are largest producers. So as you might imagine, those producers who tend to hang on to their equipment a long, long time are those smaller volume producers. Those people who also told us we probably don't harvest during the summer. We're winter people only, so they can afford to park that equipment for extended periods of time. But those high volume producers want newer equipment rotating through their business. So what are the advantages and disadvantages then of having older equipment? And we asked this again of both loggers and foresters. So the advantages are uncertainty in the marketplace. I won't be able to pay off my loan if I don't have contracts coming in. And so I feel much more comfortable not having a big loan payment and hanging on to that equipment longer. There are also concerns about the new equipment having new emission standards on it too, that will take not only new fuel, but also potentially have lower fuel economy in it. And so it'll take more gallons to produce the same volume of production. I can also fix my own equipment today, whereas that new equipment is going to take a technician. I have to get on the phone, I have to call them, they have to come from somewhere else, and they may not be able to do it today. Whereas I know how to fix my own equipment. They said that today's equipment is better built. It lasts longer. It's easier to maintain. I just know how to use it. This stuff's already paid for. It's affordable to operate, and it can remain idle, as I said before, for a long while. Disadvantages are it's getting more and more difficult to find expensive parts for these. So the parts are getting more expensive and they're just harder to find. It's just not something you'll go on eBay and be able to put a bid in on. They're just not out there like they used to be. There's more downtime. It's harder to fill contracts. Private landowners like to see new equipment, and it tends to break down more. Again, I've got a chance to ask some questions before I get into the third and final part of the webinar.
All right, folks, I'll give you a minute here again to type any questions left. We've got about 15 minutes left. It's 12:47. We're going to try to bring it in right around 1 o'clock. We will go a few minutes over time if there are a lot of questions, but unless there are a whole lot of questions, we're going to wrap up here in the next few minutes. As I said before, probably a couple minutes after Charlie starts up here again, I'll share the link to the continuing education request, credit request form. If you do want to have continuing education credits, whether it's through SAF or for a stewardship, you do need to fill that out before logging out of the session here today. Those are the requirements of the credit granting organization. So look for that in a couple of minutes here. Not seeing any questions coming in right now. I think maybe given the time here, there's one. Okay, let's take this question. From Matt again. Did you look at the correlation between product harvested and harvest/transport system?
No. So although we collected data on individual products, all we did was we lumped that together to determine annual volume cut in 2011. So we didn't do any further breakdowns on that.
All right. As I mentioned in the chat pod before, Charlie will, of course, pause for questions one more time at the end of his presentation. So I'm going to ask Charlie to continue on, and we'll take any other questions then.
Thanks, Eli. So the next set of slides really look at maybe more the future of our logging businesses in the state. And it draws upon some of the questions that we asked in our focus groups, more than some of the survey data that we asked directly of loggers. So in one of our focus group questions asked about what are the factors that lead to or the characteristics of a successful or healthy logging business. The next question is a logging industry. This one focuses on logging businesses. So we asked this of both loggers and procurement managers. So they said retaining a good business manager, not just business manager, but a good business manager, and then using those records to make decisions. So not only collecting data, but actually using it then to make decisions about perhaps what tracks to operate on or when is it time to replace equipment. So use that data to make really important decisions for the business. They need access to many and steady markets. So a successful business is going to have that access. They'll also, within those markets, merchandise their products to the highest value. So send their wood to whatever market will provide the highest delivered value for that product. Purchase reasonably priced stumpage. Plan sales to minimize costs, or buy sales even to minimize those move costs. Build relationships with agencies and mills. Accept and adopt new technologies. Retain good employees who can operate safely, and then have well-maintained equipment. So we asked the same question, but changed that last word from businesses now to the overall industry, the logging sector itself. So here we asked again loggers and foresters about successful business industry, what leads to that, and they said having and projecting a positive attitude and image. Equipment that's easy to maintain and operate. Fewer environmental regulations, whether it be SFI or other sort of standards or forest management guidelines. They'd love to see fewer regulations. Identify and address factors that increase costs, not only within businesses, but outside of them, to try to reduce some of the pressure on businesses. Have an ample supply of affordable and quality stumpage. Have young owners enter and then stay in the business. Have healthy mills. and markets in Minnesota, stable fuel prices, and then better trained foresters. So they were pointing a finger at academia, I'm sure not our students, but maybe other students who they thought were not as well trained as they should be. Then we asked them about some scenarios. So we looked at our data and thought, in the past, we've seen kind of this trend moving from many small businesses, which we still retain today, and then gradually more and more larger businesses. As we move toward larger businesses, are we going to see more and more of that in the future? Are we going to see status quo? Are we going to see more small businesses? So we asked our focus group participants to think about 3 different scenarios. The first one we called status quo. So I showed you the distribution before of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses. So status quo would say we'd really keep a comparable distribution of those 3 groups in the future. The second one was the growth of those smaller producers. So we would have a lot more producers, in this case, producing up to 15,000 cords, so a higher percentage than we have right now producing up to 15,000 cords. So it could be that percentage could increase from anywhere within that range. And then the last one was the growth of those larger producers, where we've really seen that growth from 4% back in '96 to almost 9% in 2003, up to 18% today. So kind of following the current trend, increasing growth of those large producers. So they said, in general, we think there are going to be fewer businesses in the future. There's going to be some shakeout within the industry. In terms of what scenario did they think is most likely, the small businesses said status quo. There's still a marketplace for us. Those small private landowners want the kind of things that we can do. In fact, in certain places of the state, we have a much better ability to work than larger businesses because we're surrounded by private landowners with relatively small tracts. Larger business owners tend to think we're going to see some growth of those larger businesses. And then industry said more status quo, but likely we'll see some continued growth of those large producers. So what might lead us in one direction versus another? So some said it's going to be expensive equipment. If equipment continues to be very expensive, people can't afford to buy that. What they're going to do is tend to hang on to that old equipment longer and longer. It's going to have more breakdowns. They will not be able to produce at high levels of production. So it'll tend to focus on favor small businesses. Others tend to think location, location, location. If you're in Northeast Minnesota, where you have access to more larger markets, it's going to be growth of large businesses. If you're in the western part of northern Minnesota, it's going to tend to be small businesses because you have small landowners in that area. And then others said that the loss of more mills probably have the biggest impact on small businesses because they tend to focus most of their delivery on one mill and don't have a wider basket of mills that they deliver wood to. So then in conclusion, as we look back, we see probably that into the future, we're going to see fewer businesses operating. There are fewer businesses today, and we'll probably have more loss of businesses into the future. As I look at membership in the Minnesota Water Education Program, MEP, we've seen kind of a decrease from around 450 businesses down to perhaps around 400 today. Does that mean we'll see a continued shift in the future toward fewer and fewer businesses? It's not known, but we may have capped out around 450 members, and maybe 400 is now our new floor. But we certainly have fewer businesses today and may have fewer businesses again in the future. We may see this volume dichotomy continuing in the future. Lots of small producers, 58% in this case produced only 12% of the volume. But more larger businesses and the growth of those larger businesses into the future. Businesses tend to think that profit levels are down as compared to 2008. 60% of our respondents told us that. The top issues for businesses are really unchanged from what they were in the past. I'm concerned about stumpage price and availability, my cost to deliver wood to the landing and process it, and then the cost, the price that I get at the mill. Those are my top three. The thing is, they can't easily control any of those three. And then sector-wide, it's really the health and the age and demographics of logging businesses and the equipment that's out there too. And we don't want to forget too that if we do have more markets coming into the state, we currently do have the capacity to be able to provide wood to those businesses. So in the future, probably businesses will need to continuously improve. So they'll need to think about building better relationships with landowners, with foresters, with mills. And so they need to become better communicators. They need to collect data, perhaps more than they are right now, and use that data to help them focus and determine what are the areas in which I can really maximize my profitability. They'll need to diversify their markets. So instead of relying on one market as being a primary source or a high percentage of where they deliver their wood to, they need to really diversify their market basket and find additional markets and then merchandise to that highest level possible. They also need to think about what can you do with your equipment during the summer if you can't find enough summer stumpage. Can you build roads? Can you dig sewer lines? Can you use your excavator for construction things, for big projects like that? So look to diversify your business into other areas outside of just logging. A goal there is to help them retain that business on a year-round basis. They need to think about succession planning, both inside the business, and if they can't find someone there, think about it outside the business. So when I say outside, I really mean someone who's outside the family, but inside the business. So is there someone in the family who can take this over? Or is that somebody else perhaps in the business, but not in my family? And what we heard from our focus group participants was if that person is, regardless whether they're in the business, in the family, or outside the family, you really need as a business owner to begin that transfer of business over about a 2-year period of time, because mills won't accept that new individual as being the same as that current logging business owner. It takes a long time for them to feel comfortable working with a new business owner. Foresters don't have that same level of comfort with that business owner either until they've had a chance to work with them a lot. They need to develop the ability to go out and work with private landowners, to buy stumpage successfully, to work comfortably inside the books. And then also loggers need to become more passionate about the industry. I've heard sometimes that it's really up to us as foresters to spread the gospel, but really it's up to all of us to spread the gospel about good things that loggers, logging, and forestry can do. It's not, none of us are really exempt from that. For foresters, we need to think about how can we provide access to more summer chance wood. Do we need to better look at some of our harvest sites and identify sites that really provide that potential for operability during the summer, during the right conditions, and then offer them for sale when the timber sale administrator allows us to operate on those sites versus 100% or just saying that wood would be winter chance only. So we need to evaluate sites for being summer chance and increasingly beyond what we're doing right now. We also need to think about, do we have the roads in the right place to be able to provide that summer access? So right now it may be simply a problem of there is good summer wood, but we don't have the roads to get there. So do we need to work with among our agencies to do some additional road planning to provide access to that wood? And then mills and lending institutions need to reconsider their support too. It's hard for a business owner to go to a lending institution with a 3-month contract and say, I'd like to buy a new feller buncher, a new skidder, a new cut-to-length processor that's going to cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars, and just be able to show that I've got contracts for the next 3 months. Lending institutions want to see that that business has a business plan that extends for a much longer period of time. So we need to think about how can we make things like that easier for logging business owners to be able to buy new equipment and keep their business operating more in the future. So with that, again, I want to thank Minnesota Forest Industries, Minnesota Logger Education Program, which somehow got lost off the slide, and the University of Minnesota for helping to support the project. And that's my contact information there. If anybody has additional questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them now.
All right, let's take a crack at a couple here. We have two questions. First, from Philip Held, any information on how many have had to declare bankruptcy over their business lifetime?
Great question, Philip. I do not know that answer.
Okay. Next, from Michael Dahl, were there any discussions as to agency regulations or requirements that help or hinder operations?
Mike, there were no specific ones. I think we have to talk in more detail with our loggers about that, but they did raise a lot of concerns about regulations in general and how that tended to decrease their productivity without getting into specifics with them about which ones.
All right, we're at our time. I will keep an eye if any final questions come in, but I want to remind folks again, I have typed that continuing education credit form link into the chat pod. That should be a live link, so you should be able to click that. It's a very quick form to fill out, and we do ask that you do that right away so that we can make sure to comply with the credit organization's requirements. I want to thank Charlie for a great presentation today, for bringing us up to speed on this research. The presentation was brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension and the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. We're happy to be working together on this year's webinar series. All of you who have registered will get and who have attended will get an email from me, hopefully this afternoon, with a link to that recording and any other relevant information. With that, I think I'll stop the recording. Oh, wait a minute here. We've got a couple more quick questions. Let's see if we can answer those quickly. From Bill Hagen, how far are loggers going for stumpage and having to haul? Do they get hauling allowances?
Bill, good question. We did ask loggers on average, what was your hauling distance in 2011? And it was grouped by distances. The memorable thing is 24% of the respondents said that their haul distance was more than 90 miles. And so to me, that was kind of amazing. The flip side of that is 76% say that their haul distance is up to 90 miles. And so do they get allowances? Yes. A mill, many mills will give them some transportation zone allowance. So the longer distance they have to travel, the greater that allowance will be. So they are able to offset that transportation distance, but what it does is it ties up the trucking. And so just because they may get paid more doesn't mean they can move the same amount of volume when they're traveling 120 miles that they can to a mill that's only 60 miles away. So the delivered price may work out the same to them, but they need twice as many trucks, perhaps or more than that, at 4 times as many at 120 as they do at 60.
All right, thanks again, Charlie. If there are any remaining questions, Charlie's contact information is there on your screen. Again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We had a good group here, and really appreciate it. Hope to talk to you again next month.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.